A scream split the morning silence of Whitford village, not of pain but of cruel laughter, the kind that lands like a slap across a tender heart. Eleanor froze near the churchyard gate, her basket of school papers slipping slightly from her grasp as a cluster of aristocratic ladies swept past her, their voices sharp as winter wind. "Poor Miss Whitford," one drawled, as though tasting something sour. "Always so hopeful, so dreadfully unaware. She imagines herself fit for admiration, yet even the postman avoids lingering in her presence." Another tittered, a brittle, bird-like sound. "She will never secure a proposal. Some women simply lack the charm for it." Their words, spoken carelessly, sliced with deliberate precision, and Eleanor felt the familiar sting bloom beneath her ribs. She kept her gaze down, fingers trembling as she adjusted the basket, willing her breath to remain steady. For years she had endured the village's soft cruelties, comments disguised as advice, smiles that carried pity rather than warmth, but today their derision pierced deeper than usual, as though her spirit had grown thin from too many small wounds. She stepped behind the stone arch of the gate, hidden from view, and pressed a hand to her throat. A wave of heat rushed to her face, followed swiftly by the cold realization that no matter how kindly she taught her pupils or how gently she served the community, grace would never cloak her in elegance. She was an orphan schoolteacher with a modest income and no notable connections. In a society that worshipped polished silk and ample dowries, she was little more than an afterthought. A tear slipped down her cheek before she could restrain it, landing softly on her wrist like a confession of weakness. She brushed it away quickly, chastising herself. Tears solved nothing, they only deepened the ache. She had nearly regained her composure when a shadow stretched across the ground beside her, quiet, respectful, unmoving. Eleanor startled, stepping slightly away from the gate. A man stood before her, simple in dress, though there was something in the angle of his stance that spoke of a different world. His coat was unremarkable, his boots dusty from travel, yet his eyes, an arresting shade of gray, held a depth she could not decipher. He bowed his head slightly, not with the stiff courtesy of society men, but with genuine deference. "Forgive me," he said softly, his voice low and steady. "I did not wish to intrude." She instinctively shook her head. "You are not intruding, sir. I only stepped aside for a moment." She did not wish for strangers to see her distress, yet something in the man's quiet stillness made her feel unexpectedly safe. He studied her with thoughtful concern. "I fear you were spoken to with unkindness," he said. "And I am sorry you were made to bear it." His words were simple, but they reached her in a place rarely touched. Men seldom spoke on her behalf, they certainly did not offer apologies for the behavior of others. Eleanor felt heat rise again, though this time it was not shame. "People say what they like," she murmured, clasping her hands to still them. "It is of little consequence." The man regarded her a moment and then shook his head, as though disagreeing without daring to voice it outright. He reached into his coat and drew out a white handkerchief, offering it to her with a gesture that was both careful and reverent. She hesitated, then accepted it. The fabric was of finer quality than his simple appearance suggested. "Thank you," she whispered. He inclined his head. "If you will permit me, Miss Whitford," she supplied. "Miss Whitford," he repeated. "Allow today's unkindness to rest on the shoulders of the unkind. It does not belong to you." His voice carried a quiet conviction that stirred something tender within her. Before she could respond, the bell from the schoolhouse chimed faintly in the distance, reminding her of the lesson she was meant to teach. She straightened her posture, regaining the composure expected of her. "I must go," she said, hoping he would not hear the disappointment woven through the words. "Of course," he replied, stepping aside. Yet as she walked past him, she sensed his gaze following her, not with boldness, but with a reflective curiosity, as though he had discovered something unexpected. Throughout the day, Eleanor found her thoughts drifting toward the stranger. She scolded herself each time, she had no business pondering a man she did not know. Yet his voice lingered in her memory, wrapping itself around the spaces left raw by the morning's humiliation. She wondered who he was, what business brought him to their quiet village, and why his presence felt unsettling and oddly comforting. As twilight settled, she left the schoolhouse, the air damp with the scent of distant rain. She paused by the churchyard gate, half expecting the stranger to appear again. Foolish, she told herself. Yet her heart quickened when she noticed a faint imprint in the mud, boot tracks, fresh and leading toward the woods. Unbeknownst to her, the man now stood among the trees, watching the village lights flicker against the darkening sky. His name was Alastair Ravensford, Duke of Ravensford by birth, though not a soul here knew it. He had come seeking solace from the suffocating expectations of his rank, longing for sincerity in a world full of calculation. And in the fragile quiet of a single morning, he had found it in the tears of a woman who believed herself invisible. He turned toward the distant manor that bore his family's crest, its silhouette barely visible beyond the hills. Eleanor Whitford, he murmured. If only you knew the truth I dare not speak. As he lingered beneath the shadowed boughs, a resolve began to form, unwelcome, undeniable. He had meant only to pass unnoticed through the village, yet something in her wounded grace held him fast. Tomorrow, he promised himself, he would cross her path again. The storm of morning humiliation had barely settled when the next blow of fate struck, sudden and sharp, as though life wished to test how much quiet endurance Eleanor Whitford possessed. That afternoon, the village market, usually a place of chatter and modest comforts, became the stage for a cruelty far more wounding than whispered mockery. A wooden cart overturned near the square, its produce scattering across the cobblestones. Eleanor, ever eager to be helpful, knelt to gather the bruised apples and stray carrots, unaware that her simple act of kindness would draw unwelcome eyes. As she reached for a rolling apple, a cold voice pierced the air behind her. My. Even the vegetables flee her company. Laughter rippled through the small gathered crowd, neither loud nor boisterous, but sharp enough to sting. Eleanor froze mid-reach, the apple resting beneath her fingertips as if deciding whether to offer mercy or abandon her like everything else. She rose slowly, dusting dirt from her skirts with steady hands, though inside her composure cracked. The speaker was Clara Rutledge, daughter of the local magistrate, a woman whose beauty had always been accompanied by a talent for locating weakness in others. You do try very hard, don't you, Miss Whitford? Clara continued, her smile thin. One wonders what grand ambition stirs in a woman so plain. A few of the marketgoers exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing, their silence granting Clara permission to proceed. Eleanor clasped her hands before her, more from habit than restraint. I meant only to help, she said quietly. Clara tilted her head, the glint in her eyes merciless. Help? Or perhaps attract attention? There are those who say you have been rather forward with strangers of late. A gentleman visiting our village. Eleanor stiffened. Heat crawled over her skin. I assure you, Miss Rutledge, I have spoken to no one improperly. Clara stepped closer, lowering her voice so only Eleanor could hear. A woman of your standing should be careful. People mistake desperation for invitation. The cruelty hit its mark. Eleanor felt her breath shorten, a dull ache spread across her chest, heavy and humiliating. She opened her mouth to reply, though the words hadn't yet formed, when a firm voice cut through the tension. Miss Whitford has shown nothing but courtesy. To claim otherwise is an error, perhaps even a deliberate one. The crowd parted instinctively as the stranger from the churchyard walked into view, his presence quiet yet commanding. His coat remained modest, but the authority in his posture drew every eye. Clara's expression faltered, confusion flickering before she assembled a polite smile. I beg your pardon, sir, but I fail to see how this concerns you. He met her gaze with a composed calm that unsettled her far more than anger could have. It concerns me, he replied evenly, because I witnessed what transpired this morning. Miss Whitford deserves respect, not ridicule. A hush fell. Clara's smile wavered, and she shifted uncomfortably. I did not mean offense. Intent does not erase impact, he said softly, but his meaning struck with the force of a hammer. Eleanor's breath caught. She had never heard anyone speak in her defense with such quiet certainty. Clara mumbled a stiff apology and retreated, the crowd dispersing in her wake. When she was gone, Eleanor forced herself to find her voice, though it trembled slightly. You should not have intervened, sir. She will only resent me more. He turned to her, those gray eyes steady. Then let her resentment rest with me. It is undeserved in either case. His tone held neither pity nor gallantry, only sincerity, which made it all the more disarming. She lowered her gaze. I do not wish to be the subject of talk. Nor should you, he replied. Yet here we are, in a world where kindness is mistaken for weakness. She looked up at him sharply, surprised by how precisely his words reflected her own unspoken thoughts. For a moment, something fragile and luminous flickered between them, a sense of being understood without having to explain anything at all. She felt suddenly aware of the weight of the handkerchief he'd given her that morning, tucked safely in her pocket like a secret waiting for its purpose. May I walk with you, he asked, not as a command but as a gentle offer she was free to refuse. Eleanor hesitated. She knew nothing of him, yet every instinct urged her to trust him. If you wish, she said. They moved through the square at a measured pace, the murmur of the market gradually softening behind them. The late afternoon sun cast a muted glow over the village, and with each step Eleanor felt her earlier humiliation loosen its grip. I fear I never gave you my name, he said after a moment. Alistair. He paused, as if choosing his next words carefully. Alistair Gray. She repeated it softly. Mr. Gray. A faint smile touched his lips, warm enough to stir something fluttering in her chest. I travel often, he continued. Your village was meant to be a brief stop. And yet you have lingered, she observed. I have, he said, his eyes drifting toward her. Some places hold reasons one does not expect. Her breath caught again, twice in one afternoon, a record for a woman who usually lived unnoticed. She tried to hide the sudden flush in her cheeks by looking toward the distant hills. You speak kindly, Mr. Gray. Too kindly for someone who barely knows me. Perhaps kindness is simply overdue, he replied. The simplicity of it unraveled her. Few people had offered her genuine regard without motive or mockery. She studied him for a moment, noticing the subtle refinement in his manner, the way he carried himself with a quiet elegance not common among simple travelers. Yet she dismissed the thought as fanciful. Why would a man of status wander a small village alone? As they reached the narrow bridge overlooking the stream, Eleanor paused, resting her hands on the wooden railing. Mr. Gray, why did you defend me? He stood beside her, close enough that she felt his presence like a gentle warmth. Because cruelty should never be met with silence, he said. And because you seemed undeserving of such treatment. Her throat tightened. People have always thought me insignificant. Then they have been blind, he answered, a touch more firmly than he intended. She turned to him, startled. He lowered his voice. Forgive my boldness. I only meant that there is strength in you others fail to see. She searched his expression for insincerity and found none. Instead she saw something else, a quiet admiration that frightened her more than Clara's cruelty. She stepped back slightly, overwhelmed. You are kind, Mr. Gray, but I cannot be the subject of someone's sympathy. He shook his head. That is not what this is. Before she could ask what he meant, a distant bell rang from the manor atop the hill, its chime drifting through the evening air like a summons. Eleanor watched his features shift, almost imperceptibly, yet enough to hint at a life beyond her understanding. You should go, she said softly. Your lodgings are likely expecting you. He held her gaze a moment longer, as though weighing a truth he could not yet share. Then he inclined his head. Until we meet again, Miss Whitford. She watched him walk away, his figure growing smaller against the golden horizon. Only when he disappeared did she allow the trembling in her hands to surface. She pressed her fingers to her lips, startled by the unfamiliar rush within her chest. Something had shifted, subtly, irrevocably. And though she did not yet know it, the man she believed a simple traveler now carried her fate within the quiet depths of his hidden name. The letter arrived at Eleanor's modest home like a clap of thunder, sudden and impossible to ignore. Its wax seal, deep crimson and stamped with a crest she did not recognize, trembled in her hands as she held it against her chest. The postman's hurried knock had seemed ordinary, yet now the weight of what she held made her pulse stutter. Her fingers shook as she broke the seal, and inside, the delicate handwriting, flourished, deliberate, impossible to mistake, spoke directly to her heart. Miss Whitford, it began, I cannot remain silent any longer. Tomorrow, if you will consent, I shall meet you beneath the old oak on the village green. Eleanor's breath caught, a mixture of fear and anticipation twisting within her. Her mind raced. Mr. Gray, the man who had defended her, who had spoken to her with such quiet sincerity, why summon her with a letter so formal, so urgent? Her heart told her that something had changed, though she could not yet name it. The tears she had shed at the market, the humiliation she had endured, the laughter that once seemed so final, all of it now seemed distant, like shadows receding from the first light of dawn. Yet the promise of the meeting brought a tremor of doubt. What could a simple gentleman want with a woman like her, who had nothing to offer but kindness and an ordinary life? When she arrived at the oak the following morning, the village still cloaked in the soft gray mist of early spring, he was waiting. Mr. Gray, Alastair, as she would soon come to know him, stood beneath the gnarled branches, his coat modest but impeccably clean, boots dusted from travel but polished in a way that suggested care rather than ostentation. He bowed slightly as she approached, and in that single movement, Eleanor felt a mixture of relief and confusion. Relief that he had kept his word, confusion because her pulse betrayed a curiosity she could not control. Miss Whitford, he said, his voice steady though his gray eyes reflected something more, an intensity she had not seen before. I thank you for coming. There was no ceremony in his tone, yet every word carried a weight, a gravity that made Eleanor aware of the smallness of her own voice. You need not fear, I am not here to embarrass you, nor to offer hollow flattery. His gaze softened. I come with earnest intent, and I ask you to hear me without preconception. She inclined her head, uncertain, yet compelled. I shall listen, she said, the words trembling despite her effort to sound composed. I have observed you, he began, and Eleanor's pulse quickened. Not as a curiosity, not as one measures the worth of a dowry or the promise of social advantage, but as a person. I have seen your gentleness, your courage, your dignity under the weight of the world's small cruelties. And I find myself compelled to speak plainly. I would have you consider me more than a passerby in your life. I would have you consider me a partner. Eleanor's breath caught. Her mind recoiled at the possibility, him, a stranger, yet somehow intimately known, offering her what no one else had dared. "Mr. Gray," she whispered, voice unsteady, "I am no one of consequence. My life is ordinary, my prospects limited. Why would you?" She stopped, unable to finish, the words failing to capture the depth of her disbelief. "Because," he interrupted gently, stepping closer, "it is not rank, nor wealth, nor circumstance that compels me. It is the woman you are, the heart you bear. That is the measure I honor." His hand brushed the edge of hers, not demanding, only suggesting. Eleanor felt an unfamiliar warmth, a tremor of hope that frightened and exhilarated her simultaneously. Over the coming days, their meetings became a ritual of quiet revelation. He walked with her through fields damp with morning dew, spoke with her as if her thoughts held the weight of the world, and listened with a patience that stunned her. He gifted her pressed sprigs of wildflowers, simple, fragrant, and yet chosen with a care that suggested a profound attention to detail. Each token was a testament not to wealth, but to thoughtfulness, and Eleanor began to realize that the man who had appeared so ordinary was anything but. Then came the proposal, not in a grand hall or under a chandelier, but in the meadow behind the village, where daisies nodded in the gentle wind. He knelt, not out of ritual, but out of reverence, and spoke in a voice both steady and tender, "Eleanor Whitford, I ask you to be my wife. Not for status, not for appearances, but for the truth that has grown between us. Will you walk this path with me?" Her lips parted in astonishment. The enormity of the offer, so sudden and yet somehow inevitable, pressed upon her chest. She thought of the village's scorn, of Clara Rutledge's mocking smile, of all the times she had believed herself invisible. And now, this man, this remarkable, inscrutable Mr. Gray, was offering her not pity, not convenience, but love. I do not know what to say," she murmured. "Say only what your heart allows," he replied. "I ask nothing more." She nodded, trembling, and in that quiet acceptance, a bond was forged that neither words nor circumstance could easily sever. Their wedding was held in the parish church, a modest affair attended only by those who loved her for her spirit rather than her prospects. Candles flickered in the windows, casting golden light over her simple gown, the delicate embroidery she had sewn with her own hands catching glimmers of firelight. The few villagers present offered quiet smiles, and in the pews, children she had taught watched with wide-eyed wonder, sensing the gravity of the moment even if they could not name it. Yet even as she walked down the aisle toward the man she had come to know and trust, Eleanor's heart quavered with uncertainty. For though she had agreed to be his bride, she did not yet know the full measure of the man before her. There was a quiet authority in his step, a gravity in his gaze, and something in the way the sunlight glinted off his coat that whispered of truths unspoken. The ceremony passed in a blur of whispered vows and solemn nods, and when the final words were spoken, Eleanor felt herself swept into a tide of emotion that was at once joyous and terrifying. He held her hands, not with impatience, not with expectation, but with a reverent steadiness that made her pulse quicken. His eyes met hers, and in that instant, the world narrowed to the span of their joined palms, the warmth of their mutual presence, and the quiet promise lingering between them. That evening, as they arrived at his ancestral estate, Eleanor felt a surge of wonder mingled with apprehension. The grandeur of Ravensford Manor, though subdued by the soft light of dusk, overwhelmed her senses. She could not yet fathom the life she had entered, nor the responsibilities she might bear as the Duke's wife. Yet in his presence, she felt a tether to reality, a reassurance that whatever grandeur or expectation awaited, she would not face it alone. In the private sanctuary of their chambers, the first night together unfolded without ceremony or impropriety. He took her hands, warm and steady, into his own. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice hushed yet infused with unshakable conviction, "you were always my only choice." The words, soft as a prayer, carried the weight of truth and intent. She rested her forehead against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart, and for the first time, allowed herself to believe that she was seen, valued, and cherished, not for what she had, but for who she was. Yet as dawn approached, a subtle tension prickled the edges of her consciousness. The sound of carriage wheels on gravel reached her ears, accompanied by the soft rustle of servants preparing for the day. Eleanor pulled back slightly, her pulse quickening. Who would arrive at this hour?" she asked, a note of apprehension threading through her curiosity. He paused, meeting her gaze with a careful steadiness that only heightened her sense of foreboding. "There are truths you do not yet know," he said quietly, almost reverently. "And some of them will change the world you believe you inhabit." Eleanor's breath caught. The certainty she had felt, the quiet sanctuary of the evening, now trembled on the edge of revelation. A world of grandeur, duty, and hidden identity waited just beyond the chamber door, and she realized that the path she had chosen, though filled with hope, was also a threshold into unknown complexities. And yet, despite the rising tension, she could not turn away, nor did she wish to. For in his eyes, she had glimpsed a future shaped by truth, care, and a love that dared to defy expectation. As the first hints of sunlight filtered through the heavy drapes, Eleanor pressed her hands to her lips, the weight of anticipation settling in her chest. The quiet moments of their union had given her solace, yet the promise of revelation lingered, sharp and undeniable. Outside the door, the world waited to intrude, bringing with it grandeur, scrutiny, and perhaps shock. Inside, her heart clung to the simple truth she had discovered, that she was chosen, holy and without condition. And in that fragile space between fear and hope, Eleanor realized that nothing, not rank, not wealth, not expectation, would ever diminish the tether that had been forged between her and the man who had once been Mr. Grey. Yet even as she clung to that certainty, a single question hovered like a shadow in the room. Who was her husband, truly, beyond the guise she had come to trust so completely? A carriage arrived before dawn, its wheels striking the gravel with a sound that jolted Eleanor from the fragile cocoon of sleep she had found the night before. She sat upright in the chamber, heart racing as the distant clatter echoed through the halls of Ravensford Manor. Servants scurried in preparation, their movements precise yet hurried, and she sensed instinctively that this was no ordinary delivery or early visitor. The quiet intimacy of yesterday's evening, the sense of safety she had allowed herself, fractured under the weight of anticipation and unspoken revelation. She wrapped the shawl tighter around her shoulders and approached the window, peering through the half-light of morning. Figures moved with authority near the carriage, and the crest on the door, a gilded insignia she did not recognize, shone faintly in the first rays of the sun. Her chest tightened. "Alistair," she whispered, almost hoping he would appear to calm her fears. But he did not enter at that moment. Instead, she heard his footsteps behind her, steady and deliberate. He stood close enough that she felt the warmth of his presence, and when he spoke, his voice was a measured quiet. "Eleanor, what you are about to see will test the understanding you have of me. But know this, you are not unworthy. You are not unprepared. You are chosen." Eleanor turned to him, her eyes wide, trying to reconcile the calm in his tone with the turmoil twisting in her chest. "Chosen," she echoed, her voice trembling. "I do not understand." He gave a faint, rueful smile. "I have kept a truth from you, not from distrust, but from the knowledge that the world is not always kind to those unprepared for it." He gestured toward the crest on the carriage. "I am not merely the man you have known. I am Alistair Ravensford, Duke of Ravensford." The words struck Eleanor as though she had been struck by lightning. She staggered backward, catching herself against the edge of the table. The Duke. The syllables felt foreign on her tongue, almost impossible to claim. All the quiet conversations, all the tender gestures, every shared glance, they had carried the weight of sincerity, yet now each seemed layered with the grandeur and expectation of a life she had never imagined inhabiting. "Yes," he said gently, stepping closer and taking her hands into his. "I wish to know you first, to understand your heart, before the world demanded your presence as my Duchess. I wanted our bond to be unshakable, free from the judgments of status and wealth." Eleanor felt a tidal wave of emotions, shock, betrayal, awe, and a fragile bloom of trust. I thought you were simple, a gentleman of the village, no more," she whispered, tears threatening to spill. "And yet, all this time, you carried a title far greater than I could imagine." Alistair's gaze was steady, unwavering. "Titles mean little without the heart to wield them. And it is your heart, Eleanor, that has proven more noble than any title I might bear." His words, spoken with such clarity and depth, cut through the maelstrom of her confusion and touched a chord deep within her. She wanted to retreat, to hide from the enormity of this revelation, yet she felt rooted by the sincerity in his eyes, as though she had been seen in her entirety for the first time. The servants began to move within the room, preparing for the day with the efficiency of decades of ritual, yet Eleanor felt detached from it all. Her gaze lingered on Alistair, noting the subtle tension in his posture, the way his fingers tightened briefly around hers as if to anchor himself against the unspoken weight of his confession. "I am frightened," she admitted, her voice a tremulous thread. "I do not know this world. I do not know how to be a duchess. What if I fail?" He smiled, though it was tinged with the weight of unspoken histories. "Then I shall stand by you," he said softly. "Not as a master of rank, but as a partner. You need not perform, Eleanor. You need only be yourself. That is all I have ever asked, and all I ever shall." A silence followed, heavy and intimate, broken only by the distant clatter of carriage wheels fading toward the stables. Eleanor allowed herself a single, deep breath, tasting the warmth of his reassurance. She had survived the mockery of the village, the cruel whispers of society, the sting of doubt that had shadowed her for years, but here, in this chamber, the presence of one man transformed fear into fragile hope. Then came the summons she could not ignore. A footman entered, bowing deeply. Your Grace, the estate requests your presence for the morning assembly. Lady Eleanor is invited to attend. The words carried the weight of expectation, and Eleanor's pulse quickened. Morning assembly, the first formal introduction to the household she would now inhabit. She turned to Alastair, searching his face for guidance, for permission to step into a world that now seemed both majestic and alien. Together, he said simply, offering his arm. She took it, trembling slightly, and felt a current of assurance flow through her as they walked down the grand corridor. The walls, lined with portraits of generations long past, seemed to watch, their eyes both judging and welcoming. Eleanor's mind raced. Could she meet the expectations of this household? Could she navigate the delicate webs of aristocratic duty, all while remaining true to the self that had drawn Alastair's heart in the first place? They entered the main hall together. The assembled staff and household members paused, their faces a mixture of curiosity and discreet scrutiny. Eleanor noted the subtle exchange of glances, the quiet whisper of servants seeking to discern the nature of this unexpected union. Alastair led her to the center of the room, his hand resting lightly but possessively on hers. Eleanor, he said, voice steady and commanding, this is your home now, and your presence is honored here. She swallowed, feeling the weight of the declaration settle in her chest. The world she had known, the modest schoolhouse, the quiet village paths, the familiarity of ordinary life, had shifted irrevocably. And yet, standing beside Alastair, she felt a resilience stirring within her, a strength born of the knowledge that she had been chosen, not for wealth, not for station, but for the quiet grace of her own heart. The morning unfolded with a series of lessons and introductions, each small interaction testing Eleanor's composure. She observed the household with careful attention, noting hierarchies and subtle gestures of respect and deference. Yet Alastair remained beside her, a steady presence, offering whispered guidance and quiet reassurance. The bond formed in secret now had to withstand the scrutiny of many eyes, and Eleanor found herself leaning into his support with a trust she had scarcely believed possible. By the afternoon, Eleanor began to feel a tentative sense of belonging. She had navigated the delicate greetings, responded to questions with dignity, and even exchanged polite conversation with senior members of the staff. Her confidence grew with each successful interaction, and Alastair's approving glance reinforced the quiet pride swelling within her. She began to sense that she could inhabit this world, not as an intruder, but as someone whose presence had value beyond the superficial measures of society. Yet, just as the day seemed to settle into calm assurance, a note arrived, carried by a breathless servant. Eleanor took it with hands trembling slightly, breaking the seal with a sense of foreboding she could not name. The message inside was brief, elegant, and unsettling. There are those who do not welcome your presence here. Beware whispers that seek to unsettle. Trust only those who have proven their loyalty. Eleanor's pulse quickened. The quiet victories of the morning, the tentative foothold she had gained, now trembled on the edge of uncertainty. She turned to Alastair, who met her gaze with an intensity that both reassured and warned. The path is never simple, he murmured, but you are not alone. Whatever challenges arise, we shall face them together. She nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle like a lantern in the darkness of her uncertainty. The day had brought revelation, challenge, and a profound test of trust. And though the household murmurs hinted at resistance and unspoken judgment, Eleanor recognized a truth more powerful than fear. She had a man beside her whose devotion was unwavering, whose guidance was patient, and whose heart had chosen hers above all else. As evening descended and the shadows deepened in the corners of the manor, Eleanor stood at the window, gazing across the gardens now bathed in the soft light of dusk. She felt a mixture of anticipation and trepidation, knowing that the days ahead would demand courage she had not yet fully tested. Yet beneath the fear, a quiet determination blossomed. She would rise to meet this world, not as a frightened girl, but as the woman Alastair had seen from the beginning, a heart worthy of trust, of admiration, of love. And as the last rays of sunlight faded, she heard Alastair's soft voice behind her, carrying a promise that resonated deep within her. The world may judge, Eleanor, but it is your truth that will endure. She turned to meet his gaze, and for a single, suspended heartbeat, the enormity of what lay ahead, the revelation of secrets, the scrutiny of society, the challenge of embracing her new life, pressed upon her. Yet in that same heartbeat, she understood that she was ready to step forward, hand in hand with the man who had chosen her, heart and soul, without reservation. The night settled around them like a velvet curtain, and Eleanor felt the quiet thrill of both fear and hope. Outside the walls of Ravensford Manor, the world waited with judgment and expectation, yet within, a tender, unshakable bond had been forged. And in the flickering candlelight of the chamber, Eleanor Whitford understood that the greatest revelation, the true measure of courage and love, was only beginning to unfold. The letter arrived at Ravensford Manor with an urgency that shattered the quiet of the morning, as though the world itself demanded Eleanor's immediate attention. The wax seal bore the unmistakable mark of the village, its crimson hue a reminder of a life she had once known, of streets dusted with springtime pollen and children she had taught. She broke the seal with trembling fingers, scanning the lines that spoke of both alarm and revelation. A matter has arisen that cannot wait. The truth you must now face is near, and it concerns the Duke and you. Meet at the edge of the northern woods at first light. Her chest constricted, a mixture of fear and anticipation warring for dominion. She had faced mockery, whispered judgments, and the shock of discovering Alistair's true identity, yet the tone of this note carried something heavier, a sense of inevitable confrontation. She folded it carefully, tucking it into the pocket of her gown, and felt the solid reassurance of Alistair's hand on her shoulder. "Eleanor," he said softly, sensing the turmoil that tightened her stomach, "whatever awaits, we face it together. You are not alone in this." His gaze held hers with a gravity that quelled some of her dread, though the unknown still loomed large. They rode together at dawn, the carriage wheels crunching over frost-tipped gravel, the manor receding behind them into mist and memory. The northern woods stretched before them, bare-branched sentinels standing against the pale sky. Eleanor gripped her gloves tightly, the leather rough beneath her fingers, grounding her as fear and excitement mingled. The villagers, the whispers, the judgments she had survived, they all seemed to pale in comparison to this summons. At the edge of the clearing, a figure stepped forward. A man of middle age, whose authority seemed absolute even from a distance, bowed deeply. "Duke Ravensford," he said, his voice measured, "the council requests your counsel. There are questions about your marriage, questions that must be addressed before scandal spreads." Eleanor's breath caught. The council, the guardians of protocol, tradition, and scrutiny, posed a threat far greater than any petty village gossip. Alistair's jaw tightened subtly. "And you presume that she is unaware of her duties?" he asked. His voice, though calm, carried a ripple of restrained anger. Eleanor met his eyes, finding there a steadiness that gave her courage. "I am ready," she said softly, the tremor in her voice belying the determination she now summoned. They entered the clearing together, Eleanor's heart pounding against her ribs as the council's representatives regarded her with polite yet measured scrutiny. She felt the weight of their judgment, the subtle expectations of behavior and poise, and yet Alistair remained at her side, an unspoken anchor in a sea of formality. He extended his hand slightly toward hers, a silent reassurance that grounded her even as the room of expectation threatened to engulf. "Lady Eleanor," one of the elder councilmen began, his tone deliberate, "the circumstances of your union with the Duke raise certain concerns. A match of this nature is uncommon, and the secrecy of the arrangement must be considered." Eleanor straightened, drawing a slow, measured breath. The words were formal, polite, yet carried the weight of scrutiny that could crush the unprepared. "I understand your concerns," she said, voice calm but resolute. "I am not unprepared for the duties this marriage requires, nor am I unworthy of the trust placed in me." A murmur ran through the assembly. The council members exchanged glances, the air heavy with subtle surprise. Alistair's gaze softened as he observed her, pride flickering briefly in the grey depths of his eyes. He inclined his head ever so slightly, a silent acknowledgement of her courage and composure. Eleanor felt a quiet swell of confidence. The same woman who had endured mockery in the village, who had trembled under the weight of judgment, now stood unwavering in the presence of authority, guided by the man who had seen her heart when no one else would. "Your words are sincere," another council member admitted, the edge of skepticism in his tone softening slightly. "And your understanding of the Duke's responsibilities appears thorough." Eleanor inclined her head, refusing the faint tremor that still lingered in her stomach. "I have learned," she said simply, "that duty is most honorably served when it is guided by truth and compassion." The council deliberated briefly, the tension thick in the morning air. Eleanor felt the minutes stretch, the weight of expectation pressing heavily against her shoulders. Then, at last, the head of the council spoke. "It appears," he said slowly, "that the Duke has chosen well. Lady Eleanor possesses the fortitude, grace, and understanding that will serve not only the estate but the very principles we uphold." Relief washed over Eleanor in a rush, mingled with disbelief. Her eyes met Alistair's, and he offered a small, proud smile. The remainder of the morning passed in formal introductions, the council's scrutiny replaced with tentative acceptance. Eleanor observed the estate staff and senior household members with careful attention, noting the subtle shifts of respect in their postures and the faint, approving glances directed toward her. Alistair remained by her side, offering quiet encouragement, and with each step she took, she felt herself becoming more anchored in this world she had once feared would swallow her whole. By midday, the tension had lifted sufficiently that Eleanor allowed herself a moment of private reflection. She wandered into the gardens, the scent of early blooms mingling with the crisp air, and paused beside the fountain where the water sparkled in the sunlight. She traced her fingers along the stone edge, feeling the cold smoothness beneath her touch. Here, alone with the whisper of leaves and the soft gurgle of water, she allowed herself to acknowledge the depth of her feelings. Love, she realized, was not simply the gentle gestures of shared afternoons or tender words whispered in the dark. It was courage, resilience, and trust, forged in the crucible of exposure and uncertainty. Alistair joined her then, stepping lightly across the garden path. "You are stronger than you know," he said, voice low, as if sharing a secret. "Stronger than I feared you would need to be. And yet you are gentle still, resilient without hardness. It is remarkable." Eleanor felt a warmth rise in her chest, a mixture of pride and something deeper, something tender that whispered of belonging. "I could not have done this without you," she admitted, her voice almost a murmur. He took her hands, lifting them to his lips in a gesture both protective and reverent. "And you need never face it alone. Whatever trials remain, whatever scrutiny may come, I am here. Always." The words were simple, yet they carried a weight that resonated within her, a reassurance she had not known she so desperately needed. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose, Eleanor felt a sense of completion tempered by anticipation. She had survived the council, endured scrutiny, and found her place beside the man who had chosen her wholly and without condition. Yet beyond the garden walls, beyond the gilded halls and formalities, there remained a world that would test her resolve, a society that would continue to observe, whisper, and measure her worth. And still, in the quiet intimacy of the moment, she understood that she was no longer merely Eleanor Whitford, the village schoolteacher. She was Eleanor Ravensford, Duchess by choice, by love, and by courage. And beside her, Alistair's hand on hers, she realized that no judgment, no secret, and no challenge could diminish the bond that had been forged through understanding, trust, and an unwavering recognition of one another's hearts. The evening shadows stretched long across the estate as they turned back toward the manor, each step a testament to their shared triumph. The estate, once imposing and alien, now felt like a home slowly opening its arms to her presence. Eleanor allowed herself a small, private smile. She had stepped into a world of grandeur and expectation, yet she carried within her the quiet truth that had always guided her: love, sincerity, and courage were stronger than rank or title. Yet, as they reached the manor gates, Eleanor's gaze was drawn to the horizon where distant clouds gathered, pale hints of rain glimmering in the fading light. She sensed, almost instinctively, that while today had brought clarity, acceptance, and the first triumphs of her new life, the winds of change would continue to stir. The path ahead was not without shadows, and the true depth of their journey, the unfolding of trust, of loyalty, of the heart's endurance, was still waiting to be revealed. She looked to Alistair, his profile etched against the fading light, and felt a surge of determination mingled with hope. Whatever trials remained, she would meet them, not as a frightened girl from a village, but as a woman who had been seen, chosen, and cherished. And in that quiet, suspended moment, Eleanor Whitford, now Eleanor Ravensford, understood that the greatest story had only just begun.